What if I told you there were 31 official rules for love in medieval times? Andreas Capellanus codified 31 maxims of courtly love, and rule number 1 basically said, marriage doesn't excuse you from cheating. These weren't civil laws for everyone, just a literary code the nobles followed. Meanwhile, the church was over here saying even getting horny for your own wife was a sin. How does that even work? You know what makes this even crazier? Take Abelard and Eloise. Their forbidden love affair ended in absolute catastrophe. We are talking life-destroying consequences here. This medieval mind-bender will make your brain hurt. But first we need to understand just how insane the church's control really was. The church didn't just have opinions about unmarried people hooking up. They regulated your bedroom even after you said I do. The medieval church controlled how married couples were allowed to have sex, which means your priest had more say in your love life than you did. Medieval theologians taught that enjoying sex too much, even with your own spouse, was a mortal sin that could damn your soul. Yeah, you heard that right. Getting too into it with your own husband or wife was apparently a one-way ticket to hell. The scholastic debate was intense on this topic. Gregory argued that sexual desire was morally bad, though the act itself could be excusable in marriage. Peter Lombard went further, declaring that every passionate lover of his own wife is an adulterer. Thomas Aquinas focused on how sexual pleasure caused a suspension of reason that made it spiritually dangerous. The logic was twisted but consistent. Sex was only acceptable if you felt appropriately guilty about it and were trying to make babies. Let me break down the specific rules because this gets ridiculous fast. No sex on Sundays because that's God's day. No sex on holy days, and there were a lot of those. No sex during pregnancy because apparently that might hurt the baby. No sex while breastfeeding because you're supposed to be focused on motherhood. No sex during Lent, which lasts 40 days. Add it all up and you're looking at a surprising chunk of the calendar being off limits. I mean, imagine planning your romantic life around a church calendar. The church had very specific ideas about acceptable behaviour too. Medieval penitentials listed sexual violations and corresponding penances in excruciating detail. Confession and penitentials meant sexual life could become micromanaged and shame-laden. Picture sitting in that little booth explaining your intimate life to Father whatever his name was. If you admitted to having too much fun, you'd get assigned extra prayers or fasting as punishment. The psychological damage this caused was insane. Imagine being married but constantly told your natural desires were evil. You're supposed to love your spouse but not too much. You're supposed to have sex but not enjoy it. You're supposed to be intimate but feel guilty about it afterward. The church basically created a system where married couples couldn't win no matter what they did. This wasn't just theoretical doctrine either. Church courts actually prosecuted couples for having too much fun in bed. There are records of married people being fined or forced to do public penance because neighbors reported they seemed too happy together. Yeah, being too in love with your own husband or wife was literally a crime in some places. The really messed up part is how this affected women specifically. Since women were already considered more sinful and lustful by nature, any sign that a wife enjoyed sex was seen as especially dangerous. A woman who seemed to like being intimate with her husband was viewed as potentially possessed by demons or corrupted by her base nature. Men at least got the excuse that they were just fulfilling their marital duty, but women weren't supposed to want anything at all. Think about the wedding night situation. Two people who've never been intimate before, already nervous and scared, now also worried that enjoying themselves might damn their souls. The church managed to turn the most natural human experience into a minefield of guilt and fear. Every kiss, every touch, every moment of pleasure had to be weighed against eternal punishment. Here's the weird part though. Some medieval thinkers like Albertus Magnus argued that sex within marriage could be morally neutral or even meritorious if oriented toward procreation or marital duties. But passionate, desire-first sex, that was still condemned across the board. The church created a society where even legitimate married love was treated as spiritually dangerous. Marriage was good, but married people having feelings about it was bad. You were supposed to reproduce but not enjoy reproducing. It's like they designed a system guaranteed to mess with people's heads. But here's where it gets really twisted. While the church was busy micromanaging married bedrooms, the nobility was creating their own rules that flipped everything upside. Enter Andreas Capellanus and his treatise, The Art of Courtly Love, which laid out 31 rules that basically celebrated adultery as the highest form of romance. I mean, imagine being told by priests that enjoying your wife is sinful. Then picking up a book that says the most noble thing you can do is obsess over someone else's wife. This courtly literary code spread among the nobility from the 11th to 13th centuries, and aristocrats actually followed these guidelines for how they were supposed to conduct their love lives. These rules directly contradicted everything the church taught about love and marriage. While priests were saying married couples shouldn't enjoy sex, Capellanus was basically saying marriage doesn't even count as real love. One rule literally states that marriage is no excuse for not loving someone else. Yeah, you read that right. Having a spouse was considered irrelevant to finding true love. Another rule says a true lover is possessed by constant thought of the beloved. So while the church wanted you to feel guilty about thinking sexy thoughts about your own wife, courtly love demanded you spend all day fantasizing about someone else's wife. Here's where it gets really twisted. Courtly love required the woman to be married to someone else, typically someone of higher status than the male lover. Single women weren't even eligible for this kind of romance. The whole system only worked if the lady was already taken, preferably by someone powerful. Think about that logic for a second. The most romantic, most noble form of love could only exist when it was completely impossible and totally forbidden. If the woman became available, the entire romantic fantasy would collapse. The elaborate rituals around this were insane. We're talking secret letters written in code, messages hidden in song lyrics, years of unrequited longing performed like a theatrical production. Knights would wear their ladies' colours into battle, write poetry about her eyebrows, and basically turn stalking into an art form. The lady was supposed to be cruel and distant, maybe acknowledging the knight's existence once or twice a year with a handkerchief or a smile. That was considered the height of romantic reward. This created a parallel universe where adultery was noble, and marriage was just a business arrangement. You could be a totally devoted courtly lover while treating your actual spouse like furniture. In fact, being too affectionate with your husband or wife was considered kind of embarrassing and low class. Real nobles understood that marriage was about land and politics, while love was this elevated spiritual experience that happened with someone you couldn't touch. The psychological manipulation here was brutal. The whole point was stylized devotion and suffering, not conjugal fidelity. The system was designed to keep everyone frustrated and longing forever. If you actually got together with your courtly love target, you'd broken the rules and ruined everything. Success meant failure, and failure meant you were doing it right. I'm just saying, that's some serious mind games right there. What made this even weirder was how it flipped normal social expectations. Usually, wanting something you couldn't have was considered a character flaw. But courtly love turned that into a virtue. The more impossible your desire, the more noble you were. The more you suffered, the more refined and sophisticated you appeared. Pain became proof of your elevated nature. The gender dynamics were completely messed up too. Men were supposed to serve these unattainable women like religious devotees, but those same women had zero actual power in their real lives. You could worship a lady in poetry while she couldn't even choose what to eat for dinner without her husband's permission. The whole system let men feel romantic and chivalrous while keeping women just as trapped as before. This practice was most visible in aristocratic courts and literatures, with troubadours and romance writers spreading these ideas among the nobility. It wasn't some grassroots movement among peasants. Medieval nobles literally created a system where the most romantic love was the most forbidden kind. Royal bedrooms were political vaults, and in 1314, 3 French princesses forgot that basic rule. Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Burgundy weren't just some random nobles fooling around. These were the wives and sister-in-law of the future kings of France. When their romantic adventures got exposed, it became the Tour de Nesle affair, basically the biggest royal sex scandal of the medieval period. The stakes here were absolutely insane, because royal adultery threatened hereditary succession and the entire feudal order. If any of these princesses had kids from their affairs, nobody would know who the real heirs to the French throne were. The whole system of royal succession could collapse because some ladies decided to follow those courtly love fantasies instead of staying faithful to their political marriage arrangements. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy were caught having affairs with knights. Joan was accused of knowing about the whole thing and keeping quiet. The knights involved were Philippe and Gautier d'Aunay, 2 brothers who thought sleeping with royalty was worth the risk. I mean, imagine thinking your courtly love romance with a princess would somehow work out fine. These guys apparently never considered that real-world politics might interfere with their romantic poetry lifestyle. The punishments were brutal and swift. The d'Aunay brothers were tortured and executed, getting the full medieval justice treatment. Yeah, that's what happened when your courtly love affair involved actual princesses. Meanwhile, the women faced life imprisonment, which was actually considered merciful since adultery by royal wives was technically treason and could mean death. This whole scandal destroyed multiple lives completely. Margaret of Burgundy died in prison after being locked up in the fortress of Chateau Gaillard. Blanche got imprisoned for years in the same place, living in horrible conditions with no hope of release. Joan initially got house arrest, but her life was basically over too, since her reputation was ruined forever. These women went from royal privilege to complete social destruction because they tried to live out romantic fantasies. The political chaos this created was massive. Louis X annulled his marriage to Margaret after she died, leaving questions about whether their daughter was legitimate. Philip V divorced Blanche and remarried to secure his succession. The whole royal family structure got thrown into uncertainty. Marriage alliances with Burgundy were threatened. The legitimacy of future heirs became a constant question. The French monarchy nearly collapsed because 3 women thought they could live out courtly romance fantasies. Think about how this played out in practice. These princesses probably read the same romantic poetry everyone else did. They heard about noble ladies inspiring knights to great deeds through distant, unattainable love. They saw how courtly love was celebrated in literature and music. Then they tried to live that way in real life and got absolutely destroyed by the political reality of their positions. The irony here is incredible. Courtly love was supposed to be about suffering and distance and never getting what you wanted. But these princesses actually acted on their desires and got punished worse than anyone in the courtly love poems ever did. The fantasy version had knights pining away beautifully for years. The real version had knights getting executed while the ladies rotted in prison cells. This is what happened when courtly love fantasies crashed into real-world power politics. All those romantic rules about marriage being irrelevant and love being noble became completely meaningless when actual royal succession was threatened. The same society that celebrated forbidden love in poetry had zero tolerance for it when it involved actual political power. You know what's really messed up, though? The same culture that destroyed these women for following their hearts also created the most beautiful, tragic love stories about people doing exactly what they did. Medieval society could celebrate forbidden love and punish it brutally at the exact same time. The same culture also created the most famous piece of literature showing lovers burning in hell for eternity. Dante's Inferno perfectly captures the medieval mind-bender about love. It's beautiful and damning at the same time. You know what's really messed up? In Canto 5, Dante places Paolo and Francesca, 2 adulterous lovers, in the second circle of hell. But he describes their story so romantically that medieval readers often responded with pity and fascination despite the punitive theological framing. Here's how their story went down. Francesca was married to this older guy named Gianciotto, who was apparently pretty ugly and had a limp. Paolo was Gianciotto's younger, much better-looking brother. One day Francesca and Paolo were sitting around reading about Lancelot and Guinevere, you know, that classic courtly love story about a knight having an affair with his king's wife. They got to the part where Lancelot kisses Guinevere, and boom, Paolo kissed Francesca. That was it. Game over. They started having an affair right there because some book told them it was romantic. The really twisted part is that courtly love literature literally corrupted them. Paolo and Francesca's story is literally born from courtly romance literature, which underlines how these literary conventions could inspire real behaviour. They weren't just 2 people who happened to fall for each other. They were following a script they'd read in all those romantic poems about forbidden love. The same stories that taught nobles how to conduct affairs also taught Paolo and Francesca that their desire was noble and beautiful. Then Gianciotto caught them together and killed them both. So much for romance conquering all, right? Dante's genius move was making their punishment fit their crime perfectly. These 2 lovers get blown around by eternal winds in hell, never able to touch each other again. They can see each other, they can talk, but they can never actually be together. It's like the ultimate courtly love scenario, except instead of being romantic, it's literally hell. The same distance and longing that courtly love celebrated becomes their eternal punishment. But here's the really weird part. Dante's elegiac treatment encouraged sympathy while still endorsing moral judgment. There's this crucial distinction between Dante the pilgrim, who feels pity for the lovers, and Dante the poet, who still places them in hell. Medieval readers totally got this ambivalence because they lived with it every day. They could sympathize with lovers who were literally being punished in hell for adultery. The same people who supported throwing real adulterers in prison were moved by fictional adulterers getting tortured by demons. This perfectly reflects how medieval attitudes worked. Love was simultaneously the most noble and most dangerous human emotion. It could inspire you to greatness or damn your soul forever, sometimes both at the same time. Paolo and Francesca weren't just sinners in Dante's version, they were also victims of a passion they couldn't control. Medieval people totally understood that contradiction because they experienced the tension between desire and duty, between passion and salvation. Everyone could relate to these feelings. You know what I mean? Every medieval person had felt attracted to someone they shouldn't want. Every married person had wondered what it would be like to be with someone else. Every single person had fantasized about someone who was taken. Dante just wrote down what everyone was already thinking about but couldn't say out loud. The story resonated because it showed love as this powerful force that could override everything else. Paolo and Francesca couldn't help themselves even though they knew it was wrong. They chose love over salvation, passion over duty, and got punished forever for it. But the way Dante told it, you almost understood why they made that choice. Hell looked awful, but at least they were together in hell instead of apart and miserable in life. Medieval people could hold completely contradictory ideas about love in their heads at the same time. They could believe adultery deserved eternal punishment while also thinking adulterous love was the most beautiful thing in the world. They could support executing real lovers while being moved by fictional lovers. They could condemn passion and celebrate it simultaneously without seeing any problem with that logic. This contradiction gets even weirder when you realize how actual marriages worked in practice. Medieval families treated marriage like a business merger where love was completely irrelevant. I mean, imagine your parents picking your spouse based on spreadsheets instead of compatibility. Your wedding wasn't about finding your soulmate. It was about your family getting richer or more powerful, or both. Picture finding out at age 12 that you're already engaged to someone you've never seen who lives in another country. That was just Tuesday for medieval noble kids. Families would spend months negotiating dowries, land transfers, and political agreements before the couple ever met. Sometimes they'd arrange marriages for babies who weren't even born yet. Your entire romantic future got decided while you were still figuring out how to walk. Canon law set minimum ages for marriage at puberty, around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though local customs in Northern Europe often meant first marriages happened much later, in the early to mid-20s. But betrothal was a different story. These were legally binding contracts backed by serious money and political pressure. If your family tried to back out later, they could face financial ruin or even war. Here's where it gets complicated, though. Medieval law and the church insisted on consent for valid marriages. Consummation mattered for validity too, and non-consummation could be grounds for annulment. So while arranged marriages were common among elites, poorer people often had more freedom to choose their partners. The system wasn't universally forced, but it was definitely stacked against personal choice for anyone with property or political value. The economic reality was brutal for noble families. Marriage was literally a business merger where the bride was part of the deal. The dowry system meant a woman's value was directly tied to how much property and money her family could throw in with her. Think of it like buying a car where the car comes with a bonus cash payment. The bigger the dowry, the better husband you could land. No dowry meant you were basically unmarriageable unless you wanted to become a nun. The negotiation process was insane. Families would haggle over exactly which lands transferred ownership, how much gold changed hands, and what political alliances got sealed. Meanwhile, the actual bride and groom were just sitting there like expensive trading cards. The bride's family had to pay the groom's family for taking their daughter off their hands. Then the groom's family would provide something called a dower, which the bride could control if she became a widow. The gender dynamics were completely messed up. Women were essentially traded like property between male-controlled families. Once a girl got married, everything she owned became her husband's property through coverture. Her legal identity basically disappeared. She went from being controlled by her father to being controlled by her husband. If she was lucky, she might get some independence when she became a widow, but only if she survived that long. This system was particularly brutal for noble women who got sent to foreign countries as political insurance. They were used as breeding stock to seal alliances between kingdoms. If the political situation changed, these women were stuck in hostile territory with no way to go home. Some of them never saw their families again after the wedding. If they failed to produce male heirs, their husbands could potentially send them back in disgrace. Nobles used marriage for alliances and property transfer, and sexual consummation validated unions while heirs were politically vital. But imagine two people who barely knew each other's names trying to build a life together. The girl might be 14, married to some guy twice her age who doesn't even speak her language if it's a political marriage between different regions. Medieval men wrote poetry treating women like goddesses while simultaneously buying and selling them like livestock. I mean, how does that even work? You've got troubadours singing about how their lady is this perfect, untouchable being who inspires them to greatness. while those same ladies had severely limited legal rights. Courtly love created this bizarre worship of feminine virtue while real women lived under legal subordination. The same society that said women were too pure and noble to touch also restricted women's property ownership and decision-making. Think about that contradiction for a second. In courtly love poetry, women were portrayed as morally superior beings who could inspire men to become better people just by existing. Knights would write endless verses about how their lady's virtue made them want to be noble and brave and honourable. Meanwhile, in real life, married women's property became their husbands through coverture, and single women were controlled by their fathers or male relatives. Picture a troubadour composing beautiful verses about serving his lady and being devoted to her every wish, while that same lady couldn't make legal decisions without male permission and came with a dowry negotiated like a business transaction. The courtly love ideal elevated women as moral exemplars, an idealized role that coexisted with their legal subordination. Women were supposed to be these elevated, almost divine creatures whose very presence could transform a crude knight into a refined gentleman. The lady was meant to be distant and pure, inspiring devotion through her moral perfection. But here's the reality check. Women's legal rights were severely limited, though not completely non-existent. Wealthy widows could gain some control through dower and jointure arrangements, but most women went from being their father's responsibility to being their husband's property, with no stop in between where they actually belonged to themselves. They couldn't choose who to marry, couldn't make major financial decisions, and had little control over their own bodies. The literary contradiction here is absolutely nuts. Troubadours sang about serving their ladies and being devoted to their every wish, while those ladies were legally subordinate to their husbands in real life. You've got poets writing about how they'd do anything their beloved commanded, while actual women couldn't command anyone to do anything ever. The same culture that wrote about female superiority in poems also created legal systems that privileged men in almost every situation. This whole system served a psychological function that's pretty messed up when you think about it. Idealizing women in poetry made it easier to control them in real life. You know what I mean? If you convince everyone that women are these pure spiritual beings who are too good for earthly concerns, then you can justify keeping them away from earthly power. They're too noble for politics, too refined for business, too virtuous for making decisions. It's like putting someone on a pedestal so high they can't actually do anything useful. The class element made this even worse. Only noble women got the courtly love treatment in the first place. Peasant women were just completely ignored by this whole romantic ideal. They didn't get poetry written about their virtue or knights suffering for their honor. They just got to work in the fields and live under the same legal restrictions without even the fantasy version of respect. Germanic tradition actually let husbands punish their wives severely for adultery, which really puts the courtly love worship in perspective. Roman law allowed property confiscation and banishment for unfaithful women. They solved this by creating separate compartments for different parts of life. Medieval people had their official religious sphere where church doctrine ruled everything. They had their courtly social sphere where troubadour culture and noble games happened. They had their legal political sphere where marriage meant property and succession. Each compartment had its own rules that didn't interfere with the others. This wasn't cognitive dissonance. This was a sophisticated system that actually served multiple purposes for medieval society. You know how you act differently at work versus at a party. Medieval people took that concept and ran with it. Religious rules applied in religious contexts. Social rules applied in social contexts. Political rules applied in political situations. The compartmentalization worked practically, in ways that would blow your mind. Confess on Sunday, recite a sonnet on Monday, negotiate a dowry on Tuesday. Nobody saw this as hypocritical because they were operating in different spheres. The priest dealt with your soul's salvation. The poetry dealt with your social status and cultural sophistication. The marriage contract dealt with land and political alliances. These were completely separate concerns that didn't mess with each other. Courtly love gave nobles a way to form alliances and show sophistication without threatening marriages. When you wrote romantic poetry about another lord's wife, you weren't actually trying to steal her. You were demonstrating that you understood refined culture and could play the social games that proved your noble status. The husband wasn't threatened because everyone knew this was performance, not actual seduction. It was like medieval dinner theatre where everyone knew their role. Having multiple contradictory systems meant authorities could always find a reason to punish someone if they needed to. This was actually genius social control when you think about it. If a noble got too powerful or problematic, authorities could prosecute them under religious law for their courtly love affairs. If someone challenged the church, they could be attacked for violating social norms. Everyone was always technically breaking some rule somewhere. Literature provided a safety valve for experiencing forbidden emotions without acting on them. People could read about Paolo and Francesca's tragic love affair and feel all those dangerous romantic feelings safely. They could cry over Lancelot and Guinevere's impossible passion without actually cheating on their own spouses. Stories let medieval people explore the tensions between desire and duty without risking real consequences. Medieval carnival culture shows how this compartmentalization worked in practice. During carnival season, normal social rules got temporarily suspended. Peasants could mock nobles, women could act dominant, and everyone could behave in ways that would be completely unacceptable any other time. Then carnival ended and everyone went back to regular social roles without any problem. The temporary rule suspension actually reinforced the normal system by providing controlled release. The church itself operated this way too. Priests could preach about the dangers of sexual pleasure while also acknowledging that married couples needed to have sex for procreation. They just separated the physical act from the spiritual meaning. Sex for babies was acceptable duty. Sex for fun was dangerous sin. Same activity, different spiritual context, completely different moral evaluation. This compartmentalization mattered because it provided social stability. The system allowed elite culture to channel desire into stylized forms like poetry and tournaments while preserving legal order through inheritance and political alliances. Instead of trying to resolve every conflict between competing values, they created separate spaces where different values could operate without interfering with each other. Medieval society was way more psychologically complex than we give them credit for. They just organized their contradictions differently than we do. They understood that human emotions are messy and conflicting, so they built a system that could handle that complexity without everything falling apart. I mean, think about it. Which of these medieval approaches to love's contradictions are we still using today without even realizing it? Medieval people built a system that could handle love's contradictions without everything falling apart. Our modern idea that love should be simple and consistent would have seemed totally naive to them. But here's the thing. We still romanticize suffering and unattainable passion just like they did. We still separate romance from practical relationships. We still worship people who treat us badly while ignoring those who actually care about us. So which romance cliché do you think came from medieval courtly love? Tragic sacrifice? Or worshipping someone who treats you like property? Drop your answer in the comments because I'm curious what you think. Medieval contradictions about love aren't just ancient history. They're a cautionary mirror showing us which impossible romantic standards we're still chasing today.